We are honored to host previous UX conference attendees at our NNG participant panels to share their tips and applied learnings. Here's our panelist, Jan Aland, a UX designer in Norway, as he shares his experience as a workshop facilitator in our 2021 virtual participant panel.
My name is Jan, and I'm a UX designer living and working in Norway. And I actually got started in design by making a fan site for a punk rock band called The Clash back in the 90s. And now, 20-something years later, I'm a consultant with Webstep, and I've swapped out all the punk rock bands with tech products, I guess. To kick things off, I want to direct your attention to this man right here for a second. And this is Eisenhower, and he served as the 34th president of the United States. And he was also a former military general. And in 1944, he issued the order of the D-Day to Allied forces the first day of the invasion of Normandy. And here we are looking at the actual military plant used in the invasion. And some of you might be familiar with the famous quote from Eisenhower that says, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." And he actually also followed up with the statement he made. And he said that in an emergency, the first thing to do is to take all the plans off the top shelf and throw them out the window. And when you're planning for an emergency, you must first start with this one thing. The very definition of emergency is that it is unexpected. And therefore, it's not going to happen the way you're planning. I just thought it would be interesting to set the stage with this story. And to illustrate it, I'm going to unfold a workshop that I facilitated last year, and how careful planning actually helped account for unexpected events that happened. So last year, Webstep was approached by a startup called Swipload. And in short, they're trying to ease the pain of transportation for shippers and carriers. They had a first version working, but before they could scale, they needed help with aligning the product with the user's processes, because it wasn't really matched up that great. And this was also at the time where I had signed up for facilitating UX workshops with Sarah and NNG. And in the workshop course with Sarah, we got the opportunity to get feedback on our work. So I took her up on it and sent my workshop plan over for a review. Eventually, this is what the plan ended up looking like. It was also super nice to have someone to bounce ideas around with. So if you ever get an opportunity like that with any of the team in NNG, you should jump on it, because they're just awesome people and pioneers in this field. I can also really recommend going into the courses with a real world project, because that way you can apply your knowledge toward a specific case. And in my opinion, I think that is definitely the best way to learn. As you can see, we time boxed everything down to the very last minute, and it was a full day workshop where we would capture the current situation with a customer journey map, and then we would flip it to find an optimal solution with a service blueprint. So it was a 2-part workshop in one day. And just like with the soldiers in Normandy, it really helped us get on the same page when going into the workshop. And here we are in the middle of streamlining the journey map. And this was actually during COVID, but we were lucky during that time because it wasn't that bad here in Norway back then. But yeah, hopefully we'll get back to normal days soon. But during the session, the discussion started to focus in on one specific phase. And it was also the phase that we needed to get right in the product. So I saw an opportunity there and decided to doubled down with one extra round of brainwriting where we actually surfaced some new interesting information. And with all the careful planning and time boxing we did, that really became a breeze to make that change and to move things around. Another thing is that this was right before lunch break, so energy started to come down. So if you can see on the table there, I actually had to throw out some candy, and that really got the energy back up, and the conversations started to flow against that. That's a pro tip for you there. Bring some candy so you can whip that out. The key takeaway there is that planning makes you calm, present, and aware, so you can actually bring yourself to spot opportunities like that and double down like we did. This moment was captured during lunch break, and I wish you could see the view from where I was standing because it's not nice, beautiful fjords that we have here in Norway. We received the message that two of the participants all of a sudden had to leave the workshop, and it looks like I'm enjoying the view, but in my head, I'm actually shuffling pieces around, trying to think about the group synergies. In the planning, we actually thought about doing larger groups. We've been doing smaller groups before this, so we could just pull that out of our back pockets and go with that alternative instead, which was really nice. The takeaway there is that planning really gives you optionality and flexibility, especially in terms of group planning. This is important now with the COVID and remote workshops where you have connectivity issues and so forth. So planning your groups is really important, and think about different scenarios there. So you have that optionality if something happens. At the end of the workshop with the larger groups, there were a few people that wasn't contributing as much as they had been up until this point. And I suspect that it was late in the day, or people were leaning on the rest of the group because since there were larger groups, they could sort of relax a bit more. And I was also out of candy at this point, so there was no way to bring up the energy with that. So to get everyone to contribute, we swapped things around again and did an individual brainwriting session to just squeeze out the last drop of juice from the workshop, I guess. Something that comes with being a UX designer is that you start to think in how might we statements, but that's just how it is, I guess. The takeaway there is that planning really makes room for improvisation. And at some point in your workshop, you'll have to improvise, and planning down to the very last details make it a lot easier to make changes on the fly. And you already know what you have to work with. So you can take that and also the new information from the room and improvise based on that. So that's really cool. It turned out to be a great day, and it even ended in an ovation, which I kicked off, by the way. So I'm not sure if that counts. Here we have the output from the Service Blueprint workshop. It's in Norwegian, so it might not make total sense, but I just thought I'd include it for fun. But more importantly, here's the outcome. And we actually surfaced some new opportunities that we didn't know about, which was really nice. And together with the stakeholders and the core group of users and me as a designer, we established a shared understanding, and we also got a clear direction of where we're heading, which is nice. And the last one was a bonus, which we didn't really expect to happen. That was, we saw an increase in usage from the core group, which is also pretty cool. The fun thing is that I actually facilitated a workshop with the stakeholders earlier today, And we reference this artifact, the service blueprint, because we just started working on the second phase of the product. To wrap things up, I just want to leave with the quote from Eisenhower, and that is that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And thank you for your time. I'm up for connecting with you on LinkedIn. You can message me there if you'd like. Love to chat. And in addition to that, I also run a newsletter called Case Study Club, where I write and curate UX case studies, which I send out every Monday. And you can check it out at casestudy.club, and it's free to join, of course.
Amazing.
Yep,
Thank you, Jan. So we'll have some Q&A, I think, about workshopping, and I think specifically workshopping with stakeholders, which I think is just a really interesting idea. So I would love to start there with questions. So how might planning for a workshop with stakeholders be different for you than planning for a workshop with peers, for example?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So you'll have to be really, I guess, in this case, we had stakeholders together with the users. Mm-hmm. So we had to be really careful to not let the stakeholders influence the groups too much. So we had to think about the group synergies there. I guess that's the biggest thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really, I mean, that's an interesting point in and of itself, is introducing end users into workshops, which I'm not sure if people on this call have done, but I know it's something Jan and I have talked about, which is one way, you know, in Aidan's talk, we were just talking about how to get stakeholders involved in research. And that's, you know, towards the other end of getting them involved is seeing the data and analysis of research. A completely different approach is having them actually gather the research, which you would be doing by bringing end users into a workshop. And oftentimes when you do that, you bring them in for a smaller segment of time, let them contribute and be interviewed and talk to stakeholders, and then the stakeholders then take that content and continue on. It's really interesting. Jan, we have a question. What kind of priming did you do before the workshop with those stakeholders as to what to expect?
The priming, so I shared obviously the planning with them. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. So they were all on board with what was going to happen. And in addition to that, they were also very on board with the way we thought about bringing in the users to the workshop, because in our case, it was very domain specific. So we have to have the users, we have to talk to them, and there's a lot of intricate details that we need to learn from the users. They were totally on board with that format. I don't think there was much priming besides just sharing our planning and bringing them along with on the journey.
Yeah, I think that's key though. I think the amount of priming you do has to do with how bought in your stakeholders are or not. So the question to ask yourself is, are your stakeholders bought into the idea of why the workshop is needed? And in Jan's case, the answer was yes. You know, they're bought into what we're trying to achieve. Some of you may be facilitating workshops where your stakeholders aren't even bought into why you're committing time to workshop, in which case that's a clear sign that more priming will be needed. So just sharing a plan isn't enough, but onboarding them as to why a workshop is valuable, why that co-creation is valuable. So you're not just saying, okay, we should workshop, but here's why we're workshopping. So the question to ask yourself is like where you fall on that spectrum, I think. And that should directly correlate to how much you kind of get your stakeholders on board, if you will. So I'm curious, Jan, about this like group dynamics. So how did you group people in workshops? I think that's a really common question. And what were some of the considerations that went into those group designs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in our case, we had a couple of people that were from the same organization. So we obviously want to split those up into different groups, so they weren't biased towards their organization. So that's one thing to consider. And also, I think the background that our core users had, because they were specialists or domain experts, so we really needed to have a good diversification in terms of their expertise in the groups. So that was something to think about as well.
I know Marie and I recommend the same thing. When you're designing groups, the more diversity you can bring into the group, the better. So you want to watch out for putting all designers together, because of course their conversations will be very geared towards design. And if you put all engineers together, their silos and expertise are going to lead them to think about the engineering side. What we want in a workshop is for those people to talk to each other, right? So the more that you can mix, as Jan just suggested, or if people are coming from similar teams, mix them up. If people are coming with, the same expertise, mix them all up. The only time that I think you oftentimes want to potentially keep people together is maybe keep all stakeholders or more senior people together, and then potentially keep junior people together. It levels the playing field of small groups. I wanted to ask Alicia's question, which do you have a favorite framework for kind of building out your workshop agendas, Jan? How do you even start kind of building out what you're going to do and the activities, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. But it depends on what you want the outcome to be in your workshop, and also the problem obviously you're trying to solve. I know from the course that you teach, Sarah, that you have a lot of different activities that you could pull up, and that was really helpful to see all of those. And also the way you sort of structuring, you have the discovery workshops, you have the you have all sorts of different workshop for different problems or outcomes that you want to reach.
Yeah, we actually have a great article on that for those of you who are looking at 5 different types of UX workshops, written by our colleague Kate Kaplan, and that's a really good place to start. Almost always a structure, which if you go back when we share this to Jan's kind of 2 agendas, he used the same approach, which is you want some kind of opening activity, something that gets people warmed up, something that makes people comfortable in working in Post-its or a Miro board or whatever that tool is. And then you're going to do a couple activities that make up kind of the meat of that workshop. So that would be, to Jan's point, what you're trying to accomplish. Is that understanding about the user journey? Then maybe a customer journey map. Is it looking at internal processes? Then maybe it's a service blueprint. And then you're often going to want to kind of end with some kind of actionable activity. So maybe that's ideating on those pain points, or it's making your to-do lists, etc. So Feifei dropped in that link for y'all who are looking for that 5 different workshops. It's interesting. I'm going to end here for our last kind of question, which I think will be a lot to unpack. There's an interesting discussion going on in the chat, Jan, around how to engage people who don't want to be engaged. And you kind of talked about this in Brainwriting, but I'd love to hear it broken apart a bit more. So how do you get those stakeholders who kind of are more likely to sit back, and just kind of be a wallflower? How did you empower them and encourage them to participate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we obviously had a couple of those people, the skeptics, who were sort of leaning back, arms crossed, and one thing we did was that besides bringing candy, obviously that always works, but it was just speaking speaking them up, I guess. So whenever they shared something, I just said, "Wow, that's really great. Can you tell me more about that?" And that sort of got them into the mood of sharing a bit more. So that was really helpful. And also what you said about or what we did was we broke them up into smaller groups, and also individually we had them do brainwriting individually, so that helped. And also when they presented the work, we sort of gave them also just some encouragement, which also helped, like, thank you for sharing your ideas, and that's really great. That's awesome idea. We haven't thought about that, so that's great. Just encourage them to share. So yeah.
You just said a lot there, so I'm gonna recap. First, I think making sure that people have beverages or water, have some kind of sugar in their system. I think you oftentimes see that like towards lunch, and then towards the end of the day, energy just naturally drops. So design against that. The second piece that I heard is Jan prompting people to tell me a little bit more. I do that all the time when I'm facilitating. So if someone mentions something who has been sitting back, I'll dig. I'll kind of ask them, oh, that, tell me a little bit more about that. Or can you expand that idea? So that's prompting, and that works really well in smaller groups when you're having those discussions. And then I think the third is really the biggest: put them in smaller groups. The more accountability you can create for people, the more likely they are to participate. So if you are having trouble with participation, don't do big groups. As soon as you have 4+ people are more able to sit back because everyone else will contribute on their behalf. So small groups, and give quantities. So that's another trick of the trade. When you're asking people to come up with ideas, don't just say, come up with ideas. Say, come up with 3 ideas, come up with 5 ideas. You have to give people targets to hit. It sets the expectation of what participation means. And then the last bit that Jan has said, I think is super interesting. And he said encouragement, which, Jan, I really appreciate how you, after someone presents, we oftentimes think of stakeholders better or worse, and maybe you don't if you don't have great stakeholders, but we put them on a pedestal and we say, they feel confident in what they're doing because they're our leaders. And what you forget is during a workshop, that's not always the case. A lot of them aren't used to working in such a highly active participatory role amongst others. And so I've seen over and over and over again stakeholders who are uncomfortable with a workshop format. And a little bit of encouragement for anyone, stakeholders or not, is human. You react to it, you start to feel more confident. So I think that that's a really interesting point to end with, which is words of encouragement. I'll oftentimes give those one-on-one, even if I notice that someone in a small group is sitting back. I'll go and say, that was a really interesting point. I'd love to hear more of those ideas. Yeah, Ranil, I saw this theme a little bit, like stakeholder bias, and maybe they're trying to sit back a bit to let others' perspectives come through. And that's why we oftentimes suggest putting all stakeholders together, and then all, junior designers and engineers together, so that those different kind of views can surface from both groups. If you're mixing hierarchy, then oftentimes people try to defer to the hierarchy within a small group. So just something to think about. Okay, Jan, thank you so much. Do you have any closing words before I wrap it up for all of us, since we're at the top of the hour?
You should try it and do workshops, because it is amazing once you go into it and see the real outcomes and benefits that it has. So go for it.
Yeah, it's the best way to get better at it is to just do it.
Yeah.
Start small and keep doing it.